Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me where and what time you're watching? Thanks. It was just past midnight when Chris and I left the old 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The neon signs flickered above, casting an eerie red glow over the empty street. We had spent the evening reminiscing over burgers and coffee, talking about high school memories and future plans that seemed more like wishful thinking. The town felt quieter than usual, an unnatural, almost suffocating silence, as if the world was holding its breath. As we strolled toward my car, parked further down the block, Chris began to slow. I glanced at him and noticed he was rubbing his temples, his face pale and waxy under the dim streetlights. "You okay, man?" I asked, half joking. "Too much greasy diner food?" Chris shook his head, wincing as he leaned against a nearby lamppost. "No, it's something else," he muttered. "Everything's spinning." He grimaced, clutching his stomach as his legs wobbled beneath him. I rushed to his side, grabbing his arm just as he began to collapse. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow and strained. Panic shot through me. It was clear this wasn't just a bad burger. "Come on," I urged, guiding him toward the car. Each step felt heavier than the last. "We need to get you to the hospital." We barely made it to the passenger seat before Chris completely gave out. I managed to get him inside, buckling his seatbelt as his head lolled against the window. His breathing had grown faint, and his skin felt ice cold. Without wasting another second, I jumped into the driver's seat and sped toward the hospital. The roads were deserted, the entire town bathed in a surreal bluish light that made everything look dreamlike. When the hospital finally came into view, I pulled up to the emergency entrance and screeched to a stop. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss as I half-dragged, half-carried Chris inside. The fluorescent lights in the emergency room burned my eyes as I shouted for help. A nurse and a security guard rushed over, and Chris was quickly placed on a gurney and whisked away into a triage room. I tried to follow, but the nurse stopped me with a raised hand. "You'll need to stay in the waiting room, sir. Someone will speak to you soon." Reluctantly, I turned back and entered the waiting room. It was a small, unwelcoming space lined with rows of faded plastic chairs. The harsh overhead lights buzzed like angry bees, casting a cold, sterile glow. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, mixed with the stale odor of old coffee and cheap hospital food. At the far end of the room sat the reception desk, cluttered with stacks of paperwork and an outdated computer monitor. Behind it, a tired-looking receptionist typed away with little enthusiasm, her deep eyeshadows and slumped posture betraying years of night shifts. A glass partition separated her from the waiting area, with a small sliding window for patient inquiries. A few others were scattered around the room. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled jacket sat slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the floor tiles, his face pale and haggard. Across from him, a young woman scrolled through her phone, her foot tapping rhythmically against the chair leg. In the far corner, an elderly woman with a hunched back quietly knitted, her lips moving as she murmured words I couldn't make out. A wall-mounted TV flickered above, showing a muted news broadcast with closed captions scrolling along the bottom. Beside it, a clock ticked irregularly, the second hand jerking forward as if struggling to keep up. The entire room felt suspended in some liminal state, caught between past and present. I chose a seat in the corner, trying to calm my breathing. My heart still raced from the frantic drive to the hospital. The chair was stiff and uncomfortable, offering no relief from the tension coiling in my chest. Shifting to find a better position, I felt something crinkle beneath me. Frowning, I reached down and I pulled out a crumpled piece of paper wedged into the chair. It was old, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been there for ages. Curious, I unfolded it and smoothed it out on my lap. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, like whoever wrote it had been panicked or in a hurry. The list was numbered, and as I began to read, I felt a strange mix of amusement and unease. Rule 1. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. I raised an eyebrow. That was oddly specific. Why would anyone write something like that? I glanced over at the receptionist, still typing away, oblivious to the rest of the room. Was this some kind of joke? The thought made me smirk despite the tension in the air. Rule 2. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. I let out a short, dry laugh. So now I have to be polite? I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. It was ridiculous, probably some bored prankster messing with people stuck here at odd hours. Rule 3. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. I paused. That one felt different, heavier. Who wouldn't help someone lost in a hospital? Rule 4. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. The amusement drained from my face. A chill ran up my spine, and the air around me seemed to grow colder. Why would someone write that? My eyes darted to the dimly lit hallway leading to the ER rooms. It stretched into darkness, the flickering lights casting long, eerie shadows. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. This list had to be nonsense. Rule 5. If a power outage occurs, stay seated and do not move. Rule 6. If a door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and do not look inside. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Each rule felt darker, more ominous than the last. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they were written, as though someone was desperately trying to warn me. Rule 7. Do not look through the glass doors leading to the courtyard after 4 a.m. Rule 8. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. That one made me swallow hard. The idea of a chill creeping up on you and not being able to turn around to see what or who might be there was deeply unsettling. Instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the same sterile room with its faded chairs and buzzing lights. I reached the final rule, my heart beating faster for reasons I couldn't explain. Rule 9. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. It's safe to leave after 6 a.m. My gaze flicked to the wall-mounted clock. Its second hand twitched with each tick. It read 1:30 a.m. At the bottom of the paper, written in shaky red ink, were the words, "Trust me." I learned the hard way. A dark, crusted stain marked the corner of the paper, one that looked disturbingly like dried blood. My stomach twisted. I rubbed my fingers over the words, feeling the rough texture of the ink beneath my skin. A nervous laugh escaped me. "What kind of place is this?" I whispered. Slumping back in the chair, I tried to shake the nagging unease. It had to be a prank, some twisted joke. The list couldn't mean anything. Forcing myself to dismiss it, I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts. But I couldn't stop thinking about Chris, the way he'd collapsed in the parking lot, the fear in his eyes, the quiet hum of the waiting room wrapped around me, amplifying the isolation. That's when I heard it, my name. It was spoken in a low, barely audible voice, drifting through the air like a whisper. Down the hallway, my eyes shot open and my body tensed. The voice was unmistakable. It was Chris. I jerked my head toward the corridor leading to the ER rooms, but no one was there. The pale overhead lights flickered, casting erratic shadows. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "Adam, help me." The sound of my name sent a shiver down my spine. I jumped up from the chair, my feet moving before I even realized it. I stepped into the hallway, the dim light stretching my shadow across the floor. I glanced back at the waiting room, now a few steps behind me. The other visitors remained scattered in their seats, oblivious to the voice echoing down the corridor. "Adam!" Chris's voice was more desperate now, tinged with pain. My chest tightened as I took another step forward. My footsteps echoed in the quiet as I ventured deeper into the hallway. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, some flickering out entirely. leaving long stretches of darkness. The ER room doors lining the corridor were slightly ajar, each one exuding an eerie stillness. I hesitated at one doorway and peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. A man in a hospital gown stood in the center of the dimly lit room facing me. His head jerked in rapid, unnatural movements, shaking so violently that his face was just a blur. Without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, my breath shallow as I tried to process what I had just seen. But there was no time to think. Chris's voice called out again, farther down the hallway. I forced myself to move forward, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. Another room came into view, its door half open. Inside, a doctor stood hunched over a patient on the table. The doctor's white coat and surgical mask obscured his features, but something about him felt wrong. His movements were stiff, unnatural. Then I saw the tool in his hand, a bone saw. He raised it slowly, the metal glinting under the dim light. A blood-curdling scream tore through the air, erupting from the patient on the table. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall, my eyes wide with terror. When I looked back into the room, it was empty. No doctor, no patient, just an empty, silent space. My hands trembled as I rubbed my face, trying to shake the feeling that I was losing my grip on reality. "This can't be real," I whispered. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, and Chris's voice continued to call, pulling me deeper into the unknown. As I turned the next corner, I froze. Hanging in the doorway of a nearby room was a mass of long, tangled hair spilling down from beyond the frame. It looked like someone was standing behind the door, peeking out. A single eye, black as pitch, stared at me from the darkness. A wave of nausea hit me, but I couldn't move. The figure stayed still, silent, just watching. I took a hesitant step forward. The eye vanished into the shadows. The hallway grew deathly quiet, the hum of the lights the only sound. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved past the doorway, every nerve in my body on edge. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure crouched unnaturally high against the ceiling, her head tilted at an impossible angle. This time I could see more, her elongated arms stretching out, bony fingers reaching toward me. Before I could react, the cold, stiff touch of her hand brushed against my arm. It felt like death. I bolted, my shoes squeaking against the linoleum as I sprinted down the hallway. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The first door I saw, I flung it open and stumbled through. I was back in the waiting room. My heart raced as I staggered to a stop, my chest heaving. Everything looked normal again. The reception desk, the plastic chairs, the other visitors who hadn't moved an inch. It was as if nothing had happened. But my skin prickled with the lingering touch of that hand, a chilling reminder that something was deeply, deeply wrong. I slumped back into a chair, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath and make sense of the nightmare I'd just experienced. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the crumpled list of rules, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. My eyes locked onto Rule 4 again, the words seeming to mock me. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. I had ignored it. And now I was starting to believe these rules weren't a joke after all. I leaned back in the chair, trying to calm myself, but my breathing came in short, ragged gasps. I ran my hands through my hair, willing myself to think rationally. Maybe I was just sleep deprived, or maybe the stress of seeing Chris collapse was finally catching up to me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the sensation of that cold, lifeless hand brushing against my arm lingered, sending chills rippling through me. I glanced at the clock. 1:45 a.m. The minutes seemed to drag on, each one amplifying the dread that had taken root in my chest. My thoughts drifted back to the list of rules. Each one seemed absurd on its own, but after what I'd experienced, I found myself scrutinizing every word. That's when I noticed him. A man who hadn't been in the room before. He stood near the entrance, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a long coat, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone. A jolt of unease shot through me. I was certain he hadn't been there earlier. I would have remembered. His tall, lanky figure and the unsettling way his gaze lingered on each visitor made my stomach knot. I quickly pulled the list from my pocket, my eyes darting to Rule 3. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. The man's gaze found me. He started walking toward where I sat. Every muscle in my body tensed. His movements were deliberate, his intent unmistakable. He stopped a few feet away, leaning slightly forward as though inspecting me. "Excuse me," he said in a calm but unnervingly deliberate tone. "Could you help me find the ICU? I seem to be a little lost." His voice was polite enough, but there was something off about it, something wrong. It was as though he were mimicking normal speech but couldn't quite get it right. I glanced around the room. No one else seemed to notice him. The receptionist didn't even look up. Gripping the list tighter, I stammered, I'm sorry, I can't help you." The man didn't move. He just kept staring, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice softening, almost coaxing. "It won't take but a moment. It's just down the hall, right?" Guilt gnawed at me for not helping him, but the words on the list flashed in my mind. Do not help them. I forced myself to look away, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, he took a step closer. "It's not very kind to ignore someone who needs help," he said, his tone now edged with something darker, something that made my skin crawl. I risked a glance at his face. For a split second, his features shifted. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, the corners extending too far. The teeth behind it were jagged, uneven. I shot up from my chair, stumbling backward. The man's smile didn't waver. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me from a new angle. Then, without a word, he turned toward the reception desk and began walking. Slowly, unnaturally. At one point, his head snapped toward me, the same grin plastered on his face. I froze, unable to look away. When he reached the reception desk, he didn't stop. He walked through it, and then he disappeared. My gaze darted around the waiting room, searching for any sign of him. But there was nothing. No trace he'd ever been there. The other visitors remained in their seats, as oblivious as before. They were still exactly where they had been moments ago, their expressions unchanged, their movements as mechanical as before. I glanced back at the receptionist. She remained at her desk, her face bathed in the pale glow of the computer screen. My eyes flicked up to the clock on the wall. 1:58 a.m. Rule 1 flashed through my mind. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. A few minutes later, my gaze drifted toward her out of habit. Just for a second. The receptionist was staring straight at me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. She wasn't moving, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I tore my eyes away, my pulse racing as I turned my head. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her rise from her chair. Her movements were unnervingly stiff, as though her joints didn't bend properly. She began walking, not around the desk, but through it like it wasn't even there. I froze, not daring to look directly at her again. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breaths quick and shallow. The air around me grew colder, the chill pressing against my skin. It felt like she was getting closer, each step an impossible leap across the waiting room. I heard the faintest rustle of fabric, the soft creak of footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Don't look. Just don't look, I told myself, gripping the edges of the chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I sat there, tense and unmoving, eyes squeezed shut, willing her away by sheer force. It felt like hours passed, though it could have been only moments. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then everything went still. The room fell into an unnatural quiet, the buzz of the fluorescent lights the only sound tethering me to reality. Slowly I opened my eyes, half expecting to find her inches away, her face twisted into something inhuman. But the receptionist was back at her desk, looking down at her monitor. Her posture was calm, as if she'd never moved at all. The others in the waiting room remained unchanged, as though nothing unusual had happened. I glanced at the clock, 2:40 a.m. Relief washed over me, and my shoulders sagged as the tension began to ebb away. Forcing myself to my feet, I found my legs shaky beneath me. I couldn't just sit there trapped like a cornered animal. I needed to move, to clear my head. As I stood, I remembered Rule 2. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. I wasn't about to take any more risks. Turning to her, I gave a small nod and mumbled awkwardly, hi. My voice wavered slightly. She didn't look up or react, just continued typing away at her keyboard. I took that as a good sign and started walking a slow circle around the room, forcing myself to act normal. The chill in the air hadn't fully disappeared. As I walked, I felt subtle shifts in temperature, a lingering cold that seemed to trail behind me. The overhead lights flickered faintly, casting brief shadows along the walls, giving the unsettling impression that the room was expanding and contracting with each pulse. Rounding the corner, I felt a presence behind me, something that hadn't been there before. I didn't hear footsteps, but I sensed it, like unseen eyes pressing against my back. It was close, just out of reach. My instincts screamed to turn and look, to confront whatever was creeping up behind me. But I clenched my jaw and kept my gaze forward, remembering Rule 8. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. I walked faster, my pulse hammering as the chill grew stronger with every step. The lights buzzed louder, their flickering more erratic, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Something brushed the back of my neck, cold and light, like a breath. I didn't stop until I reached the chairs, sinking into one with a shuddering breath. The presence faded, though. The air stayed icy, and I rubbed my hands together, trying to bring some warmth back into them. I glanced toward the reception desk, half expecting to catch the receptionist watching me again. But she remained focused on her monitor, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Leaning back in the chair, my heart still racing, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was deeply wrong. Those rules on the crumpled piece of paper weren't just random scribbles left to spook people. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't a prank. The only way out seemed to be playing along. I sat there for a long moment, my body trembling as I tried to calm my nerves and steady my breathing. That's when I heard the automatic door slide open with a soft hiss. My head snapped up, expecting to see another late-night visitor or maybe a nurse making their rounds. Instead, my heart nearly stopped when I saw who stepped inside. It was Chris. He looked perfectly fine, normal even. His face had color. His clothes were clean and casual, the kind he always wore on nights out. There wasn't a single sign that anything had been wrong with him. Relief washed over me, and I felt the tension in my muscles finally begin to ease. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe everything that had happened tonight was just in my head. Chris's eyes met mine, and he broke into a small smile as he walked over. "Hey, Adam," he said casually, his voice the same as always. "They let me out early. Told you I'd be fine." The relief was so overwhelming that I laughed out loud. "Chris, man, you scared the hell out of me," I said, shaking my head. "Are you sure you're okay? You looked pretty bad earlier." He shrugged, giving a dismissive wave as he settled into the chair next to me. "Yeah, I'm fine now. Whatever it was, I guess it passed. They ran a few tests and said there's nothing serious." He flashed that familiar grin, the one I'd seen 1,000 times. Guess I'm just too stubborn to stay sick. As we talked, something in the back of my mind began to itch. There was an unsettling quality to the conversation, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Chris was acting normal. Too normal. His tone was calm, deliberate, his words perfectly measured. I brushed it off, blaming my frayed nerves after everything I'd been through. Still, as he kept talking, a strange sense of déjà vu crept in. It felt like the conversation was looping back on itself, repeating the same phrases. His voice had the same rhythm, the same inflection, like a recording on a loop. Suddenly, I turned my head and saw a nurse walking briskly down the hallway, pushing a gurney. My stomach dropped when I saw who was lying on it. Chris. He was unconscious, hooked up to a heart monitor, an oxygen mask covering his face. I whipped my head back toward the chair beside me, but it was empty. The Chris who had been sitting there was gone, vanished, as though he'd never been there at all. A cold wave of panic surged through me and my skin prickled. I stared at the empty chair, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I saw the nurse passing the waiting room. She glanced at me briefly, her expression neutral. I jumped to my feet. "Wait," I called after her. "My friend. He was just sitting here. What's going on?" The nurse slowed, turning to face me with a small, tight-lipped smile. "Your friend is stable," she said, her tone calm, "but he hasn't woken up yet." Her words hung in the air, leaving me cold and confused. I glanced back at the empty chair, then at the nurse as she continued down the hallway. My head spun. Had Chris really been here? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I sank back into my chair, my body heavy with exhaustion and fear. My eyes flicked to the clock. 3 a.m. Time was moving, but not in the way it should. I felt trapped, like each passing minute was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't understand. With trembling hands, I pulled the crumpled list of rules from my pocket and unfolded it. My eyes scanned the lines again, desperate for answers, but there were none. The words only deepened the mystery, twisting in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. My mind felt like a riddle I couldn't solve. Time seemed to move strangely now. I couldn't tell how long I'd been sitting in that chair or how long I'd been wandering the room. The clock above me seemed to skip minutes or stall entirely, and my sense of reality continued to blur. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to me like a shroud. I glanced at the clock again, 5:55 a.m. Almost there, I thought. Almost free. That was when a security guard appeared in the doorway, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the waiting room floor. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a calm, almost reassuring presence. He walked toward me with an easy stride and stopped just a few feet away. "Sir, it's time to leave," he said in a deep, measured voice. "The ER is closing for non-patient visitors." I blinked, my thoughts catching up slowly. But my friend Chris is still... Just then I saw Chris walking out of the ER hallway. He waved to me, a tired but genuine smile on his face. Relief flooded through me, and I started to get up, then hesitated. The words from Rule 9 echoed in my mind. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. I turned my gaze toward the clock above the reception desk. 6:01 a.m. My shoulders sagged in relief. I was finally free of this place. I nodded and followed the security guard toward the exit, Chris walking beside me. As we stepped out into the cool morning air, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We got into my car and I started the engine, pulling out of the hospital parking lot. The tension in my chest began to fade, but as I drove, a strange unease crept over me. The world outside the car windows seemed darker than it should have been. I glanced at the sky. It was still a deep, inky black with no trace of the early morning light. It was too dark, too quiet. I squinted, peering between the trees lining the road, and my heart skipped a beat. In the shadows, I saw a faint figure standing there, their form barely visible, distorted as if they were made of mist. Panic surged through me. I glanced at the dashboard clock and my stomach dropped. 4:30 a.m. How was that possible? It had been well past 6 a.m. when we left the hospital. I turned to look at Chris in the passenger seat, my heart pounding in my ears, but it wasn't Chris. there was a shadow sitting beside me. Its form was a vague silhouette, its face obscured, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel its eyes boring into my skin. I gasped, my grip on the steering wheel tightening as my vision blurred with fear. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. Suddenly, I was back in the waiting room, seated in the same stiff plastic chair. The security guard stood in front of me, a grin spreading slowly across his face, his eyes unnaturally wide and gleaming in the harsh fluorescent light. "Time to leave," he said again, his voice echoing in my head like a taunt. I felt my mind start to unravel. Had I ever left the hospital at all? Was I trapped here, destined to relive these twisted events over and over again? I buried my face in my hands, my breathing ragged as a sense of hopelessness washed over me. It felt like hours passed, but it could have been minutes or even seconds. I didn't know anymore. I was dimly aware of a nurse standing in front of me, her voice calm and soothing, pulling me back from the edge. "Sir, your friend is stable," she said gently. "He's going to be okay, but he needs rest. He'll be transferred to a hospital room soon, and you can visit him during regular visiting hours." I looked up at her, my vision clearing slowly. The waiting room was just as it had been, no sign of the security guard or anything out of the ordinary. I glanced at the clock. It read 6 a.m. A soft glow of morning sunlight filtered through the glass doors, filling the room with a warm light. The nightmare was over. I nodded to the nurse, murmuring my thanks, and stumbled out of the ER. The cool morning air was a welcome relief. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see something out of place. But it looked like any other hospital in the early light, mundane and unthreatening. I got in the car and drove home, the sun finally rising to chase away the last remnants of darkness. Later that day, I returned to the hospital to visit Chris. He was awake, sitting up in bed and looking surprisingly well for someone who had collapsed so suddenly the night before. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I pulled a chair up to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Chris chuckled weakly. "Better than I should, I guess," he replied. "But I had the weirdest dreams last night. It was like I was half conscious the whole time." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of dreams?" Chris frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall. "One of them was, I came in the ER and saw you sitting in the waiting room. You looked pretty freaked out. Then there was another one. We were leaving the hospital together, just driving away into the night." A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, weird," I said quietly, my mind racing with the memory of the night's events. As we sat there talking, I kept glancing at the hospital room clock, watching the hands move slowly forward, marking time. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there in the darkness of the night, I had just escaped. Something was still waiting, watching, and the rules of this place would not be so easily forgotten.